Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Appreciate you joining us on this Wednesday as we continue here in the Gospel of John. We are in the 13th chapter, near the end of it, and a couple of transition pieces, but really important, significant things happen in both of these short passages. Just read them one at a time. I'll jump in here at verse 31, and then we'll come back and discuss it. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I'm only with you a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, I now say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You should also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." Remember that yesterday Jesus had identified Judas as the betrayer, at least to some small subset of the disciples, possibly even just the one. And Judas had left. Now we have Jesus beginning a kind of long discourse with the disciples, and hear these words that in John never wants us to miss the point, so he often states it over and over again.
Buttresses.
Yes, the Son of Man has been glorified and been glorified in him, and if it's glorified, then there's more glory, and he's glorify him again. The point is, I think, that God is about to be glorified, and God is about to glorify Jesus. And in John, that's always a reference to the cross and the resurrection. To be glorified is to reveal the work of God, what God is doing, and we now are on the verge of that happening. And so then Jesus, a little less cryptically, says, "I'm with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said, where I'm going, you cannot follow, you cannot come." And this does a couple things, I suppose, Michael. One, it introduces the idea of separation. I think literarily, it also casts Jesus out on an island a little bit. We begin to see Jesus separate himself, not in the sense of relationally, but in the sense of his mission, his work that only he can accomplish, and this idea that he's about to undertake this thing on his own. And the disciples, though they will benefit from it, they will not be able to take part in it as he is the only one. And I mean, we've seen that before, but I think maybe that's part of the function here.
And it's also connected to that idea of glory, I think, because realistically what Jesus does and therefore represents in John is someone who comes to do something on behalf of the disciples that very clearly the disciples couldn't do for themselves. And I agree with you, Clint, that there's a way in which we do get tongue-tied reading, or maybe eye-tied reading the text here in John. But I think there is something really significant in this idea. The Son of Man's been glorified, God's glorified in him. If God's been glorified in him, then God will also glorify him in himself and will glorify him at once. What I love about John is that John imbues the text with mystery. That from the very start, Jesus is not someone who can easily be compressed down into one thing. And the language itself keeps us from oversimplifying who Jesus is into the miracle worker, or the good teacher, or the radical. All of these ways that he's been read historically, I think John Clint really resists that. John presents Jesus as someone who, at the very delivery of his teaching, is impossible to pin down exactly. There's a mystery embedded inside of it. And yes, all of this glorifying, I'll be honest, sometimes people, they take it too far. They read a book like John and they get caught on, distant sort of rabbit trails, and it takes them far afield from the point that John's trying to make here. I think relatively simply, the point is Jesus is saying that if you see me, you see God glorified. If you see God glorified, you see God's work in the world, and that's the revelation. That's the thing that God is doing in Jesus, is God is making Jesus great, and Jesus is therefore making God great. And mysteriously, somehow God and Jesus are connected in this amazing, mysterious, incarnational kind of way, and we're not supposed to be able to pin it down. I think that's not that John needs a defense, but I just think we're going to see a lot more of this to come, where John presents the teachings of Jesus in some very flowery language with a lot of circling back around. It's really easy, I think, to get caught up in that, maybe frustrated by that, but at its best, I think we could see in it John resisting oversimplification. This is who Jesus is. It's mysterious, and that's what the gospel is. The revelation is mysterious, and that's not a weakness, that's a strength.
I think you also can read these words relationally, Michael. I mean, you could make a case, and I think a reasonable case, that when it comes to a doctrine like the Trinity, that's not explicitly stated in the gospel, but it is inferred from passages like this. And I think we see evidence here that what God experiences, Jesus experiences. There is a symbiosis here. There's a connection here in which what is glorifying to one includes the other, that they are together, that they are related, connected. And in that, we begin to lay the groundwork for some of our theological understanding that comes well after the writing of the gospel, of the mysterious doctrines in which we could say that God is three and one, that Jesus is two natures but one man. All those things that will be fleshed out later have their kind of origin story in these kind of cryptic passages. And I think that, that gives these passages a complexity, but also a deep value, because ultimately they're going to point us in new ways of understanding the gospel. And speaking of new, this last part of the passage is probably the best known. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. The word commandment in Latin is mandatum. If you've ever wondered about the holiday or the church day, Maundy Thursday, the Thursday before Easter, that is taken from this exact phrase. I give you a new commandment, a new mandate in English, Maundy Thursday, the Thursday of the new command. And I suppose we've heard Jesus say things like this, so maybe it's less compelling or novel to us. But these are stunning words, and there is a great depth here. My commandment, and it's a new commandment, that you love one another. As I have loved you, you should love one another. That call to the discipline and the character and the practice of love is a clarion call, a signature of Christian faith. And I think John does us a wonderful service by, that's complicated as the front part of this passage may be, the back part is that simple, at least to understand. Now, to do, incredibly difficult. But to understand, very easy. We are called as the people of Christ to show love, to love one another, to love each other. And this is the new way of life that Jesus calls his disciples to. And it's just that important. It's well said. I think this is an incredibly meaningful text for all people who would call themselves Christian.
So it's a foundational text. And I think the temptation is that you read words like this in verse 34 and 35, and you say, well, there's the teaching. And you think that 31 through 33 is somehow just disconnected, like John sort of, got stuck on repeat or something. And I want to be clear, these are connected. The revelation of God, the glory of Jesus Christ is connected to the command to love one another. And a point I want to make there is, remember, this theme of love, Clint, has been in John this entire time. John 3:16, for God so what? He loved the world. Why? So what? So how did God love? He sent his only son. And it goes on to talk about the revelation of that son and what that means. I think here, this idea that God is glorified, that Jesus Christ is the representation and revelation of God's will and plan for the world, that is intrinsically, inseparably connected to this idea of loving one another, because the way that Jesus reveals God's love, the way that Jesus is glorified, is through self-giving on the cross, is through giving up, is through self-emptying. And so what we discover here is the center of the Christian faith because of who Jesus is, right? And that's unbelievably important. This is not because it's just a good moral idea. It's not just simply because Jesus taught us this and it's a really good practice that all of us should put as best practice in our life. Well, the case that John is making here is that the revelation of God, the glorification of God that is intrinsically caught up in this mysterious relationship, therefore leads us as the people of God to practice and live out that faith in a way that loves one another. How will we be known? We'll be known by our love. How will we be connected to the one who we follow? Because we represent his love in the world, right? And so once again, a thing that was relational and mysterious about God's relationships, I think now we begin to see has impact on our relationships. And John is going to have an unbelievably poignant emphasis upon love throughout the rest of this book. And we get some of that in the first, second, third John epistle letters as well. This kind of just robust understanding of what it means when one encounters Jesus, one by definition is transformed and renewed in love. I don't think, Clint, that John could conceive of a world in which a person encountered the source of love and they did not live out that experience in the world. I just don't know that someone who can get caught up in the glory of God, as John describes here in Jesus' own teaching, could then therefore be someone who goes out and does damage to their neighbor, someone who goes out and spites someone that they are a family member to. I just, that it's impossible to be a member of the faith and to live differently than the source of that faith. And I think John's making that case compellingly in this section.
So I don't always know what to do with the Gospel of John, but these are the kind of passages that I love and hold on to and kind of try to, mine out and understand. And so here we have this concept of love, and it is foundational. I give you a new commandment. In other words, Jesus, having established his authority in this gospel, says to the disciples, I'm now going to command you of something. I'm going to set a law before you that you love one another. And then he goes on to say that love should be as he's defined it. As I have loved you, so you should love one another. Now, they don't yet know what that means. They've not witnessed the cross. They've not witnessed the resurrection and the ascension. But what that means for us is that we're not talking as disciples of Jesus about love that is just being nice to people, just sort of, warm fuzzies. This is a love that is defined by the life of Jesus Christ. It is a love that we see in the one that we follow. And because that's true, we get this last verse, which I personally is my favorite. I find the most powerful. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So if Christians are going to be known for a thing, if Christians are going to be identified as Christians because of something they do, it should not be church, wearing a cross, boycotting certain products, doing this or not doing that. All of those things may have their place, but at the very core, the foundational identity we receive is to be those who love one another. That this is the defining characteristic of what it means to follow Jesus, that we are committed and disciplined and empowered to love one another. And if we are going to be known for something, it should be how we practice that, how we love others. And that, again, is just this foundational call to the faith. And now, is that everything it means to be Christian? No, of course not. But in this gospel, as we approach the pinnacle, the climax of the gospel, we are going to run into this word more and more. As Jesus has loved us, we are to love one another. And not only that, that's how people should know that we love Jesus in the first place, by our disposition toward others. Michael, that's about as challenging a call to the faith as I think you could find.
The sort of horizon that this opens, if you let me say it that way, I think is really challenging for the church, because we, for generations upon generations, every generation waiting for the return of Christ, finds ourselves tempted to define ourselves by a myriad of things, whether in our culture or in our time. But when Jesus says this, it's not only in red letters, it's not only a command, which we have elsewhere. Jesus literally explicitly says, a new command that I give you, love one another. And may that love exist in such a way that others will actually recognize my followers based upon the way that you love one another. If you let that sink in, it is equally convicting and inspiring. It's equally demanding, and it is equally gracious. Because ultimately, and I think you're going to want to make sure to join us for our study tomorrow, because this text that's going to come next may seem disconnected, but there's a kind of grace in even seeing Peter's denial, which we're going to find tomorrow, because Jesus knows that those who follow him will not be able to give up like he's giving up, with the perfection, with the care, with the other self-giving of Jesus's willingness to die for us. Jesus knows that we are not going to achieve perfectly, but yet Jesus wants us to follow the command that our love is so committed and disciplined and so intentional that our definition and our identification in the world will be connected to the perception of how we do that with one another. And I'll tell you what, Clint, there's a lot of things that it means to be Christian, but no one graduates from this school. No one graduates out from this task. This is a fundamental core of the faith that we need to return to every day of our life, because we are always intrinsically tempted to put ourselves in the seat of judgment, whether that's over ourselves or others. And the truth is, Jesus's command is to love one another. And one can only do that when we recognize, absorb, and seek to live out the kind of self-giving that Jesus demonstrates. It's his love that we seek to emulate in our lives. And somehow, mysteriously, Jesus empowers us to do that more and more, the more that we enter into that disciplined habit. But this is so important, and yet it's just a tip of an iceberg in John of the kind of love that he's portraying Jesus having.
I think that, one way to sort of consider this, Michael, is to say, if you asked people of faith, how Christian were you today? How would you evaluate your faithfulness today? It's interesting that Jesus calls this a commandment because our minds might instinctively go to, did I swear today? What did I look at on the computer today? Was I truthful to people? Was I kind to people? Did I keep commandments? Did I break commandments? How did I spend my money? We would probably instantly consider a list of behaviors and what we did or didn't do.
Right.
And yet this commandment is single-minded in its focus to say that one way a person could and arguably should answer that question is to say, did I show others love today? How Christian I was is directly related to how loving I was. Now, could we have lots of conversations trying to spell that out? Sure, we definitely could. But at its heart, our answer to the question of how well we're following Jesus is inseparably tied to how well we're loving others. And we don't need to beat that into the ground. We got a little bit to cover here, but this is at the heart of the gospel, and certainly the heart of this gospel, undoubtedly.
Because it's the heart of the one who this gospel is seeking to point us to. And I think, friends, that's really where we really pause the conversation here today. I think that I certainly hope if you found this conversation helpful, you give it a like. Do subscribe, though, because I think what we're going to discover as we make our way forward is when Jesus talks about love, he's not talking about the greeting card kind of love that pervades our society. Jesus is talking about a decision that's made and a commitment that is followed. And what we're going to discover is Jesus is aware of our fallenness and brokenness and our inability to love in the way that he does. And I just think, I hope you'll join us as we begin to see how perfect Jesus is in this work and how much grace and freedom that has been given to us as we seek to live it out in the world that we've been called to be witnesses to. Glad to have you with us. We'll see you all tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.